astounding examples of the possibilities of faith. Gandhi wielded more potential power than any man living in his time. And he had this power despite the fact that he had none of the orthodox tools of power, such as money, battleships, soldiers, and materials of warfare. Gandhi had no money, no home. He did not own a suit of clothes, but he did have power. How did he come by that power? He created it out of his understanding of the principle of faith and through his ability to transplant that faith into the minds of 200 million people. Gandhi accomplished the astounding feat of influencing 200 million minds to coalesce and move in unison as a single mind. What other force on earth, except faith, could do as much? How an idea built a fortune. Editor's comment. Although the following story is not exclusively about faith, and it makes no mention of autosuggestion or the subconscious mind, Napoleon Hill included it at this point in every edition of Think and Grow Rich. In fact, as Hill says, this story illustrates at least 6 of the 13 principles of success. But faith is at the center of it. If the central figure, Charles M. Schwab, had not mixed his big idea with absolute unwavering faith that he could pull it off, the whole history of American business would have been different. This is the end of the editor's comment. The event chosen for this illustration dates back to 1900, when the United States Steel Corporation was being formed. As you read the story, keep in mind the following fundamental facts, and you will understand how ideas have been converted into huge fortunes. First, the United States Steel Corporation was born in the mind of Charles M. Schwab in the form of an idea he created through his imagination. Second, he mixed faith with his idea. Third, he formulated a plan for the transformation of his idea into physical and financial reality. Fourth, he put his plan into action with his famous speech at the University Club. Fifth, he applied and followed through on his plan with persistence and backed it with firm decision until it had been fully carried out. Sixth, he prepared the way for success by a burning desire for success. If you are one of those who have often wondered how great fortunes are accumulated, this story of the creation of the United States Steel Corporation will be enlightening. If you have any doubt that a person can think and grow rich, this story should dispel that doubt. You can plainly see in the story of United States Steel the application of a major portion of the principles described in this book. This astounding description of the power of an idea was grammatically told by John Lowell in the New York World Telegram, with whose courtesy it is here reprinted. Editor's comments. In order for the modern reader to fully appreciate the following newspaper story, it is appropriate at this point to provide some background information about the main players. Charles M. Schwab was Andrew Carnegie's right-hand man and president of the Carnegie Steel Corporation. Andrew Carnegie was a wealthy and powerful steel baron whose company controlled 25% of the iron and steel production in America. J.P. Morgan was a wealthy and powerful Wall Street banker whose company had arranged the financing for many of the major industrial companies in America at the beginning of the 20th century. All the reader needs to know about the other men mentioned in the story is that at the beginning of the 20th century, finance, business, and industry were dominated by a few hundred men, most of whom had amassed great fortunes through some connection with the railroads that had opened the country. These people were well known to readers of the New York World Telegram because of their financial influence. And that sets the stage for the following newspaper article, which is not only a fascinating story about the power of faith in an idea, but also a wonderful example of the irreverent writing style that was used by many newspaper journalists of the day. This is the end of the editor's comment. A pretty after-dinner speech for $1 billion. When on the evening of December 12, 1900, some 80 of the nation's financial nobility gathered in the banquet hall of the University Club on Fifth Avenue to do honor to a young man from out of the West Not half a dozen of the guests realized they were to witness the most significant episode in American industrial history. J. Edward Simmons and Charles Stewart Smith, their hearts full of gratitude for the lavish hospitality bestowed on them by Charles M. Schwab during a recent visit to Pittsburgh, had arranged the dinner to introduce the 38-year-old steel man to Eastern banking society. But they didn't expect him to stampede the convention. They warned him, in fact, that the bosoms within New York's stuffed shirts would not be responsive to oratory, and that if he didn't want to bore the Stillmans and Harrimans and Vanderbilts, he had better limit himself to 15 or 20 minutes of polite vaporings and let it go at that. Even John Pierpont Morgan, sitting on the right hand of Schwab as became his imperial dignity, intended to grace the banquet table with his presence only briefly. And so far as the press and public were concerned, the whole affair was of so little moment that no mention of it found its way into print the next day. So the two hosts and their distinguished guests ate their way through the usual 7 or 8 courses. There was little conversation, and what there was of it was restrained. Few of the bankers and brokers had met Schwab, whose career had flowered along the banks of the Monongahela, and none knew him well. But before the evening was over, they, and with them Money Master Morgan, were to be swept off their feet, and a billion-dollar baby, the United States Steel Corporation, was to be conceived. It is perhaps unfortunate for the sake of history that no record of Charlie Schwab's speech at the dinner ever was made. It is probable, however, that it was a homely speech, somewhat ungrammatical, for the niceties of language never bothered Schwab, full of epigram and threaded with wit. But aside from that, it had a galvanic force and effect upon the 5 billions of estimated capital that was represented by the diners. After it was over, and the gathering was still under its spell, although Schwab had talked for 90 minutes, Morgan led the orator to a recessed window where, dangling their legs from the high, uncomfortable seat, they talked for an hour more. The magic of the Schwab personality had been turned on full force, but what was more important and lasting was the full-fledged, clear-cut program he laid down for the aggrandizement of steel. Many other men had tried to interest Morgan in slapping together a steel trust after the pattern of the biscuit, wire and hoop, sugar, rubber, whiskey, oil, or chewing gum combinations. Editor's comments. The Random House College Dictionary defines a trust as an illegal combination of industrial or commercial companies in which the stock is controlled by a central board of trustees, thus making it possible to control prices and destroy competition. Many of America's new industrial companies had grown so quickly that they were not yet profitable. They were saddled with huge debt incurred in raising the capital to finance their rapid expansion, and at the same time they were faced with having to cut costs and slash prices or go out of business. The answer for many was to join up with others in related industries to form what were called trusts or combinations. Although trusts were illegal since the passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, companies still tried to find ways to monopolize their industries, and if their efforts weren't technically trusts, they were something very close. The one thing the large company owners who assembled these trusts needed was cash to buy up the many smaller companies they would have to own in order to effectively dominate an industry. J.P. Morgan was the banker who financed many such takeovers. This is the end of the editor's comment. John W. Gates, the gambler, had urged it, but Morgan distrusted him. The Moore boys, Bill and Jim, Chicago stock jobbers who had glued together a match trust and a cracker corporation, had urged it and failed. Elbert H. Gary, the sanctimonious country lawyer, wanted to foster it, but he wasn't big enough to be impressive. Until Schwab's eloquence took J.P. Morgan to the heights from which he could visualize the solid results of the most daring financial undertaking ever conceived, the project was regarded as a delirious dream of easy money crackpots. The financial magnetism that began a generation ago to attract thousands of small and sometimes inefficiently managed companies into large and competition-crushing combinations had become operative in the steel world through the devices of that jovial business pirate, John W. Gates. Gates already had formed the American Steel and Wire Company out of a chain of small concerns, and together with Morgan had created the Federal Steel Company. But by the side of Andrew Carnegie's gigantic vertical trust, a trust owned and operated by 53 partners, those other combinations were picayune. They might combine to their heart's content, but the whole lot of them couldn't make a dent in the Carnegie organization, and Morgan knew it. The eccentric old Scot knew it too. Editor's comments. Andrew Carnegie was born in Scotland and came to America when he was just a boy. He made his first move to join the elite group of American tycoons when he quit his job as a bobbin boy in a cotton mill, earning $1.20 a week, and got a job as a telegraph messenger boy. He soon taught himself to operate a telegraph key, which got him hired as personal telegrapher and secretary to the head of the Pennsylvania Railroad. It wasn't long before he'd worked his way up the ranks to superintendent of the Pittsburgh division, which in turn put him in a position to become an early investor in the Pullman Company, which became the leading manufacturer of railway cars. Carnegie's investment in Pullman and some successful real estate ventures gave him the capital to go into business for himself. At the end of the Civil War, Carnegie left railroading and started a company that built iron bridges for railroad companies. From building iron bridges, it was a short step to starting his own steel mill, which led him to acquire control of other steel mills, then his own coal fields to supply his smelters, then his own ore boats and rail lines to haul the ore and coal. Because of Carnegie's vertical integration and his use of the most up-to-date manufacturing methods, he was able to sell top-grade steel at the lowest price. He managed to drop the price of steel from $140 a ton to $20 a ton. By 1899, the Carnegie Steel Company controlled about 25% of the iron and steel production in America. The smaller steel manufacturers couldn't compete with Carnegie, so they went to J.P. Morgan for help. He arranged for the financing, and a wide-ranging alliance was put together of companies that were in the business of manufacturing products made from steel. Part of the deal was that they would not buy steel from Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie was not about to be put out of business by a collection of small companies. He announced that he would buy or build his own manufacturing companies to produce finished goods made of steel. This is the end of the editor's comments, and the New York World Telegram story continues. From the magnificent heights of Skibo Castle, he had viewed, first with amusement and then with resentment, the attempts of Morgan's smaller companies to cut into his business. When the attempts became too bold, Carnegie's temper was translated into anger and retaliation. He decided to duplicate every mill owned by his rivals. Hitherto, he hadn't been interested in wire, pipe, hoops, or sheet. Instead, he was content to sell such companies the raw steel and let them work it into whatever shape they wanted. Now, with Schwab as his chief and able lieutenant, he planned to drive his enemies to the wall. So it was that in the speech of Charles M. Schwab, Morgan saw the answer to his problem of combination. A trust without Carnegie, giant of them all, would be no trust at all. A plum pudding, as one writer said, without the plums. Schwab's speech on the night of December 12, 1900, undoubtedly carried the inference, though not the pledge, that the vast Carnegie enterprise could be brought under the Morgan tent. He talked of the world future for steel, of reorganization for efficiency, of specialization, of the scrapping of unsuccessful mills and concentration of effort on the flourishing properties, of economies in the ore traffic, of economies in overhead and administrative departments, of capturing foreign markets. More than that, he told the buccaneers among them wherein lay the errors of their customary piracy. Their purposes, he inferred, had been to create monopolies, raise prices, and pay themselves
their
back
brain
dividends out of
development.
privilege. Schwab condemned the system in his heartiest manner. The
Massaging his
short-sightedness of
head,
such a
his
policy,
brain,
he told his
it
hearers,
is growing
lay in
right
the
now
fact
and
that it
get
restricted the market in an era when everything
coming
cried for
together.
expansion. By cheapening the cost of steel, he argued, an
and
ever-expanding
listen to
market
the most
would be created.
important book
More
ever
uses
wrote
for
in
steel would be
this
devised,
country.
and a goodly portion of the world trade
Think and
could be
Grow
captured.
Rich.
Actually,
Grow Rich
though
by
he did not
Napoleon
know it,
Reed.
Schwab was an
By
apostle of
Napoleon
modern
Hill.
mass
Think and
production.
Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill.
Editor's comments. For J.P. Morgan, all of Schwab's talk about economies of scale and expanding markets meant only one thing. Until that night, it was